this work on an equitable phase out of fossil fuel extraction, it comes out of a now fairly long-standing process um, by the Civil Society Equity Review to try and provide some helpful analysis relating to the equity dimensions of a globally fair um, response to the climate crisis. Most of what we've done since 2015 in Paris, when the first reports came out, first analysis came out, had to do with fair shares of mitigation and an analysis of the NDCs and an equity critique of the NDCs, including climate finance. And for the last 3 years, our reports have focused on the fossil fuel extraction phase out and what would it look like for that to be fair. What we published this past year was not only sort of the general framework, which had been presented before, but also an analysis to go with it to try and answer two key questions. One is how fast do countries have to phase out to be consistent with 1.5 and with equity? And what are the implications in terms of climate finance? So I'll just get into it. Um, just for your information, the Civil Society Equity Review Coalition, at this point, the reports are being endorsed by on the order of 300 organizations, I think it is from around the world. So I'll start with what's come to be known as the fossil fuel production gap. And many of you might be familiar with this, so I'll go through it quickly. But basically, it's a recognition that if you look at government production plans and projections for fossil fuel extraction and use over the coming half century, what you see is this red line. If you look, on the other hand, at a production pathway that would be consistent with limiting warming to 2 degrees, that's a much lower rate of production, that's the green line, and 1.5 degrees, that's this purple line. And this fairly massive gap between them is the fossil fuel production gap. And one thing to note immediately is that we're way off course as far as what governments and corporations are planning to do as far as fossil fuel production. And another thing to note is that if you look, well, I mean, so far off course that by 2030, which is coming very quickly, we'll be producing more than double the amount of fossil fuels as would be consistent with a 1.5 degree pathway. Moreover, if you look at countries' emission reduction policies, so this is NDCs and then various other pledges beyond that, um, the gap between what governments are planning to produce and what would be fossil fuels that governments are planning to produce and what would be consistent with 1.5 pathway is even larger than the gap between countries' NDCs and 1.5 pathway. There's been a lot of attention put toward the need to enhance NDCs, the need to come up with a more ambitious round of NDCs with more implementation of mitigation plans, where we're actually even further off course as far as fossil fuel production. So there's a clear need for more attention to what a global phase out of fossil fuel production would look like. We can't assume that just because we have some pressure on reducing emissions, it automatically will mean a reduction in production. Fossil fuel production has its own political economy, its own momentum, its own political um, influence and power that keeps it alive as a sector. So giving attention to it is critical. Okay, so moving on from that, um, clearly this is a very difficult thing for countries to do, and it's difficult for many reasons. And it's not merely because of the political power of fossil fuel producers. There are a lot of other reasons that are more linked to developmental concerns. For example, one key one is that the fossil fuel sector does provide a significant amount of employment for many countries. And there can be particularly heavy dependence on the fossil fuel sector in specific locations or regions, and in specific countries that are highly dependent. This is an especially large challenge to deal with where there's a high level of existing background unemployment that a country is already dealing with and lack of alternatives for addressing unemployment. Um, it's also a particular challenge in countries that are very dependent on a vulnerable informal sector or migrant workers. The loss of jobs for them, where they have no protections, clearly causes a lot of social disruption. Another transitional challenge is that many countries rely very heavily on on fossil fuel production for public revenue. I'll be showing some data on this, but there are countries that rely overwhelmingly on fossil fuel revenues to provide the regular public services that people depend on for education, for health, for welfare, for the functioning of government institutions, and for everything that the public sector provides in terms of functioning infrastructure and such. Um, a third challenge is that the fossil fuel sector is a source of investment for many countries. It provides the funds for financing investments in upstream sectors, downstream sectors, and to a rapid fossil fuel phase out presents the threat of stranding existing capital assets. Another challenge is that many countries rely heavily on fossil fuel exports to balance their trade. This is particularly important where countries otherwise would have a significant trade deficit and where they're heavily indebted and rely on fossil fuel revenues for servicing debt. And then in many developing countries, there are other existing constraints to diversify an economy. There's macroeconomic vulnerabilities. Often these are associated with what people refer to as Dutch disease or the resource curse. Often countries that are highly dependent on one sector, on one extractive sector, also have institutional and governance weaknesses, various forms of corruption and patronage, lack of social trust, and other deeply rooted social inequalities. And then this is occurring when many countries are facing headwinds generally for to achieve eradicate poverty and achieve developmental progress. Um, they're competing globally for investment and for markets in a world where they may have very minimal competitive advantages relative to other countries. They may be constrained by indebtedness. There are constraints on what countries can get investment for and what types of policies and industrial policies they can implement associated with, for example, investor state dispute resolution constraints, intellectual property rights limits, various geopolitical pressures, etc. So the challenges, particularly for a country that is very heavily dependent on fossil fuel production, can be very severe. And a rapid phase out presents the potential for significant disruption if these forms of dependence aren't somehow dealt with. And so, given that backdrop, what we had presented now a few years back as a Civil Society Equity Review are a set of principles for a globally equitable fossil fuel phase out. The first is stop extraction when it violates human rights. And there are many places in the world where there are severe human rights violations associated with fossil fuel extraction. Many that immediately come to mind are, for example, the Niger Delta, and the environmental and human rights egregious violations that have happened there, or in the Amazon on indigenous territories, or there are many examples. Second is phase out global extraction at a pace that's consistent with the 1.5 limit. So this 1.5 itself, as we know already, is causing significant damage and harms, and even that is a bit of a compromise. But as you will see, the pace that would be required by 1.5 really is quite severe, and a faster phase out presents even greater challenges that would be that would arguably be impossible to face. Third is reduce extraction fastest in those countries that are least socially dependent on extraction. There are many countries, including significant producers, that have big fossil fuel sectors, but e economy-wide and society-wide, they're not extremely dependent on it, and they have the resources, financial and institutional and technological, to manage that potential disruptions of a rapid phase out. And so those are the ones that should reduce extraction fastest. Share transition costs fairly. So a rapid transition is going to incur costs, and they should not be simply the burden of those countries that are phasing out. All countries are benefiting from fossil fuel as an energy source, and so the cost of transition should be shared according to countries' capacities to bear those costs. And lastly, enable a just transition for workers and communities. Phasing out has to be done where there is the potential for um, transitioning to alternative forms of employment, for providing social benefits that are currently being funded with fossil fuel revenues, for ensuring that energy needs are met, et cetera. So the national transition has to be done in a way that's just, which involves providing support internationally for that. So what does this mean somewhat more concretely, going from these sort of high level principles to something more specific? Well, first, phasing out fossil fuels along a time frame that's consistent with 1.5 means no new fossil fuel production. What you see here is the emissions associated with the existing extraction infrastructure associated with coal, gas, and oil. So these are wells that already have been dug and are already producing oil and gas from existing reserves. These are mines that are already functioning and reserves that are in those mines. And on the right side, what you see is the existing infrastructure we have for consuming fossil fuels, electric sector, industry, transport, and buildings, and others. Both of them exceed 1.5 already considerably, meaning that there's not room for expanding the amount of fossil fuel infrastructure we have. There's not room for expanding the amount of fossil consumption infrastructure that we have without blowing the 1.5 budget even more, or without stranding those assets even earlier. Not only do they exceed 1.5, but the existing fossil fuel extraction infrastructure alone almost hits the 2-degree limit. So even if we were to relax the climate requirement to 2 degrees, we pretty much can't develop new fossil fuel resources in any event. And then on sort of the social level, fossil fuel production is no longer, if it ever was, a viable pathway to equitable development. Fossil fuel production invariably harms the poorest in society. That is simply an empirical fact that's been seen around the world, whether it's in the U.S. in Louisiana, where there is Cancer Alley associated with the refineries there, or whether it's in Nigeria, or whether it's in Angola, it invariably harms the poorest in society. Importantly, we have so little time that we don't have the liberty to slowly and carefully and cautiously develop a fossil fuel sector in any countries. And that's the only way in which historically we've seen that fossil fuel production or extractives generally can be developed without producing a resource curse, without all of the corruption and patronage and human rights abuses and macroeconomic problems that are associated with extractive development. And third, because we ultimately have to phase out rapidly, and because we're moving in that direction. The investment sector is starting to realize this. There are more and more policies being developed. Momentum is building to phase out fossil fuel. So countries that now invest will be left with stranded assets. Not only the stranded assets financially, but also the pollution associated with fossil fuel production infrastructure, and the debt associated with um, uh, assets that have not been paid off. So what is a global pace consistent with 1.5? What I'm showing here is oil, gas, and coal production, the total emissions from which is consistent with what the IPCC has put forward as their so-called low emission demand scenario. Now, this is a scenario that is consistent with 1.5. If I recall correctly, it has only quote unquote only low overshoot. And Cece, you could clarify that or correct that if that's not right. Um, and which does it relies on negative emissions. There's roughly more than 200 gigatons of negative emissions required in order for this pathway to be consistent with 1.5. The LED pathway does not use CCS and does not use BECS. It does assume negative emissions from afforestation and reforestation. Now, how that would be undertaken, whether that really would be consistent with biodiversity goals and whether it really would be consistent with maintaining food security is unclear. We don't know whether 200 gigatons of negative emissions is possible. So this has to be considered a a somewhat risky pathway. It's risky because 1.5 is risky. It's risky because it presupposes the um, the availability of 200 gigatons of negative emissions, and yet it still shows production declining in the next roughly 15 years by by about 90%. So this is risky and yet it's extremely challenging. And so, how we allocate the effort among countries to phase out becomes very important. Rapid phase out means more potential disruption, and how the effort is equitably distributed becomes extremely important for a rapid phase out like this. So, phasing out existing fossil fuel production. An equitable phase out and how rapidly countries have to phase out, it has to be seen to be about managing the social impacts and costs of a rapid transition. It's about understanding what types of disruption could occur and how to minimize it. It's not about allocating some notional right to extract fossil fuel or to assume that there's going to be continuing benefits from fossil fuel extraction and allocate that according to some principles. It's about understanding that a phase out has to be rapid, and this is about managing the impact so that they are minimized and most fairly distributed. What that means is that countries that are most dependent on fossil fuel extraction, and recall the list of types of challenges that countries face, employment, revenue, et cetera, countries that are most dependent on fossil extraction will face the greatest social impacts from a rapid transition and therefore should have the most time to transition. Countries with the lowest capacity to manage challenges, and that's financial capacity, technological capacity, institutional capacity, they'll require international support as well as more time to enable a just transition. So interpreting this in sort of more concrete terms, in terms of data about how dependent are countries, here's an example of how to think about that. So what we see here are the main producers of oil and gas. And on the y-axis, you see basically how wealthy a country is, GNI per capita in US dollars. And note, this is a log scale. So this is 1,000, this is 10,000, this is 100,000. On the x-axis, what's shown is the percent of government revenue that is derived from oil and gas sales. And so immediately you see how widely varied countries are in how dependent their public sector is on fossil fuel revenues. You have countries like the US, Canada, the UK, which are among the world's largest producers. In fact, the US is the world's largest producer of gas. the world's largest producer of oil, as well as the largest consumer of gas and largest consumer of oil. And yet, almost none of its public sector revenue comes from fossil fuel production. On the other hand, you have much poorer countries like East Timor, South Sudan, Iraq, Libya, who re- who rely more than 80%, up to nearly 100% on the fossil fuel sector to provide government revenues. And this means to pay the people who are providing education in public schools, who are providing healthcare in public hospitals, who are maintaining infrastructure, who are running the institutions, as well as whatever social security benefits citizens of that country have. And so a rapid phase out in terms of the ability of a government to provide those resources, those services, varies dramatically between a country like the US, Canada, the UK on the one hand, and countries on this end of the chart on the other hand. In addition to that dramatic difference in level of dependence, there's of course the importance of how wealthy a country is and how able it would be to manage those costs. There are some countries, like say Norway, which gets a non-trivial amount of its public sector revenue from oil and gas sales, but it's much, much wealthier than, say, the Congo, which gets similar amount of their public sector revenue from oil and gas sales. And so how these countries are supported in meeting the challenges of a rapid phase out purely has to be seen also in terms of what are their own domestic needs and capacities for meeting those challenges. So there are many different dimensions of a country's dependence. Revenue is not the only one. What we did for this analysis was we looked at three main dimensions of national dependence on fossil fuels. The first one is their dependence on fossil fuel production for their own domestic energy supplies. The second is the public sector revenue dependence on fossil fuel production. And the third is employment. And all of these, to come up with a general sort of multidimensional reflection of a country's dependence, we scaled by dividing by a country's capacity to overcome dependence. So a wealthier country is, the more manageable these types of overcoming these types of dependence would be. The poorer a country is, the more challenging it would be. And so it's this sort of composite indicator dependence that we used. In this analysis, what we did was we weighted each of these equally, although one might argue that, well, maybe some are more important than others. Maybe jobs are something that could be met more easily by new investments than replacing public sector revenues. And so this should be more important. But what we've done for the purpose of this analysis is weight them all equally. How we define capacity was not simply income, but rather it was the ability, it was income considered in a progressive way. Progressive in the sense that that countries think of domestic taxes. A dollar earned by a rich person is worth more than a dollar earned by a poor person. And if there's interest, we can go into the details of how we define capacity. But basically, it was very similar to the way that many countries define their tax system in terms of exempting a certain amount of income below a certain threshold level and counting income higher as you go toward a higher level. So using global data sets to cover all fossil fuel producing countries, we calculated this dependence indicator for each fuel, coal, oil, and gas, for each of the producers. And as sort of a schematic framework, this is what we did. The lower the level of dependence, um, the the more rapidly a country would have to transition, and the higher level dependence, the less rapidly. The lower a country's capacity, the more support they would get, and the higher capacity, the more they would contribute. And so a simple sort of two-dimensional framework for thinking about obligations in a globally fair fossil fuel phase out, depending on both capacity and on dependence on production based on this three-component indicator that I showed. As far as fair sharing the cost of the phase out, we take into account both the capacity of a country, defined in a progressive way, and responsibility for historic greenhouse gas emissions, because historic responsibility is an important issue in our global climate regime. And this is what would determine fair shares of international support. The details, the technical details, the formulas and such that we used are provided in the report that was issued at the Dubai COP. And so here are the results. And this is the results specifically for oil. And what you're looking at here are countries again against their capacity per capita in dollars per person, and then the phase out year for oil specifically. And so where a country falls here depends on their income and also on how dependent they are on oil production specifically. And so we see some countries, major oil producers included, like the United States, Norway, Qatar, etc., that have, despite having a high level of production, the U.S. itself is something like 20% of U.S. oil, of global oil production, fairly low dependence in terms of jobs, revenue, and domestic energy production. And so their phase out time frame would be very rapid. Within the first few years of the 2030s, they would need to effectively phase out production. There are other countries, some of which are wealthy, Kuwait, Saudi, that have a higher level of dependence and would have more time. But even in those countries, just because of how much budget there is, they wouldn't have a whole lot of time. Saudi Arabia pushes past 2040, but almost all other countries are, I mean, majority of other wealthier countries are before, no, I guess it is all other wealthier countries are before 2040. And the threshold I'm using to divide wealthier from poorer is the global average capacity per capita. Among the poorer countries, there are some significant producers that are still not terribly dependent in terms of those three indicators, and they would have rapid phase outs. There are some that are extremely dependent. South Sudan was mentioned, Iraq was mentioned, Equatorial Guinea also, Libya was mentioned. And these would have the longest amount of time to slowly phase out production. Even that, though, again, is not a long time. 2050 is still within the lifetime of much of the capital that they would have already invested in. And these are all, I mean, these dates are set, these timeframes are set so that they're consistent with the LED pathway, with the amount of energy and with the total budget that is available within 1.5 degrees. This is gas, time frames and support relating to gas production. Again, the wealthier countries tend to go more rapidly. They tend to be less dependent. There are some poor countries, including some major producers like Trinidad and Tobago, Turkmenistan, that have the longest time frames, and others that are poor, India, for example, that would have very short time frames because they are not that dependent on gas. They would still be eligible for support to help with the transitional challenges, but they still have a very rapid time frame. And then finally, coal. And one thing you'll notice here is that for all countries, the coal timeframes tend to be more rapid. They're crowded toward the 2030 end of this range. And that's because countries just generally don't tend to be as dependent on coal production. Coal isn't responsible for as many jobs as oil and gas. Coal doesn't generate the kind of revenue for governments that oil and gas does. Um, um, and uh, coal does tend to have a significant contribution to domestic production. But again, that's only one of the fossil fuels. And so to the extent that they're um, um, producing coal, it's only to meet the domestic in general power supply um, fuel demand. Um, and now one thing that you've seen on each of these three charts is a set of countries here with some percentages, and sorry, all countries above this line have percentage. This is the percentage of support that these countries would have to provide to help cover the transitional costs of poorer countries. And again, this is determined by taking countries above the global average capacity per capita and allocating the total 100% of global support required to these countries according to their capacity. The countries you see on the right edge here are those that don't produce fossil fuels, but they still lie above the global average capacity per capita level and therefore should be contributors. We argue here that it's not just fossil fuel producers that should provide support. It's all countries because all countries have been using fossil fuels as an energy source, and the benefits of fossil fuels have flowed to them as well. This final chart shows the amount of support, the percentage of support of each of this set of the countries providing the largest amount of support. There's more countries in this chart, but they're not shown here. And they sum to only 2.2%. Now, we did a fairly back of the envelope sort of analysis of what the cost per year might be of a global transition. And it was based on a smattering of studies that had been done across different individual countries and a rough attempt to try and aggregate, extrapolate costs from those countries that came up with 200 billion per year. And so if the cost ended up being 200 billion, roughly 200 billion, this is the amount that each of these countries would need to provide um, in support to countries that require support. Now, we don't really know what the total cost would be. This is something that hasn't been done before, so we don't know what the costs are. And there's also an open question about what falls within the scope of transitional costs. What diversification is it's a very complex and economy-wide thing. And so there's an active discussion about what should be eligible for support, what are legitimate needs for climate finance. And so here are the conclusions. There's no right to extract fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, despite the fact that they are indeed a national resource, they're also a national resource that's killing the planet. So there's no right to extract fossil fuels. Fossil fuels should be phased out as quickly as possible everywhere. However, the pace of that phase out that is possible differs between countries. Those that are more dependent on fossil fuel production, those that would face greater social disruption from trying to phase out rapidly, will need more time to enable a just transition. An equitable phase out is about enabling a just transition in different country circumstances. It's not about allocating some benefit of fossil fuels. And phase out timelines and international support are inseparable. They have to both be seen as part of a fair framework. There's no such thing as a fair fossil fuel phase out timeline, period. There just is not enough budget. There's just not enough time. It would inevitably cause disruption and costs in developing countries in particular that it wouldn't be fair for them to have to bear alone if international support is not also part of the fair share framework.